Go ahead and jump into it and talk about WIDA and the global scale of English. So, really quickly, again, if you haven't met me before, I am Sarah Davila. I am an international language learning expert. I have been working in language education for my entire adult life. I started off my journey as a classroom teacher, and I worked all the way from preschool, all the way up through high school and into university settings. And then I started training teachers. So, I've got that experience end to end. And I think the most important thing on this slide is somehow in my life, I have managed to adopt not one, but four Shih Tzu puppies. So I have a lot of dogs around here. And if you suddenly hear things blow up, just ignore it. It's the dogs. But we're not here to talk about puppies. We're here to talk about the global scale of English. And I'd love to tell you a little bit more about that. So you may have heard of this before. You may not have heard of this before. If this is your first time, the global scale of English is a phenomenal tool and a great resource for language educators. And this GSE is essentially a collection of learning objectives that have been psychometrically aligned to the Common European Framework of Reference, or the CEFR. The CEFR is a fantastic scale. It covers multiple different languages and it's used broadly internationally. But a big challenge with the CEFR, and really with a lot of language learning scales, is that it takes a lot of time to make progress and it's not always easy to understand what do I need to do to help my students get to the next level in English. So having these granular little steps and learning objectives actually makes it easier for us as educators to plan our lessons. And to do this, what Pearson did was essentially create thousands of learning objectives. These objectives were then psychometrically aligned to the CEFR. And since then, Pearson has done additional alignments to other scales and frameworks that are used internationally to help support learners wherever they are. So if you're going into the global scale of English, you can now find the alignment of the GSE to the WIDA can do descriptors, which is extraordinarily valuable for understanding how to support our multilingual learners in those different multi-level classes that we're always working with. If you have students who are coming in at that lower emerging level and maybe some students who are also at that bridging level, how do you plan for both of those students? And the global scale of English can be very supportive there. If you get into the objective set, you'll note that there are 3,000 plus objectives that are available, and the global scale of English includes a comprehensive set of grammar objectives as well as a massive vocabulary set. Additionally, the global scale of English teacher toolkit also includes a text analyzer, which you can use to actually analyze the difficulty of your text and get information and recommendations on how to level that and make that more appropriate for your students. So it's a fantastic tool. Finally, a useful thing to know if you're working with very young learners, like pre-primary students, there is a global scale of English for very early learners that covers that preschool, kindergarten, first and second grade, those early years. And then there's the global scale of English for young learners that starts at age 7 and goes all the way through our middle years. That really covers a lot of the learning students will do there. And then there are additional sets. There's the global scale of English for adults. You can start using that with your high school students, those older students. Then there is the global scale of English academic that can also be used with your high school students, those who are interested in going on to high school or to go to college in the future. Then we also have the global scale of English for professional learners. So if you're working with adults or professionals who might be thinking about their career, there is a GSE there for you as well. So this is a comprehensive resource, a fantastic tool, and having it aligned to those WIDA can-do statements is great for you in the classroom because this allows us to think about how we can really plan to support our learners in a lot of different ways. So let me take you over to show that. And Amandine, if you don't mind clicking that slide one more time. So this is where I get really excited about the GSE. I'm going to do a quick teacher pop quiz. So mentally in your head, if you know this already, you feel very proud of yourself. The acronym I'm going to give you is ZPD. So if anybody knows what that means, have a think about that. You're going to see me do this on the screen. What is the advantage of having a granular learning objectives? It's all about that ZPD. And if you thought zone of proximal development, then you are very much thinking about the same thing I'm thinking about here. So when we're creating language learning programs, one of the big challenges that many of us have, especially with multilingual learners in our classroom, is that these students are all working at different levels of proficiency. And if you're familiar with the WIDA proficiency descriptors, you know that that's covering student ability from entering, where students are coming into their language learning experience, through to emerging, developing, expanding, and then finally into bridging and mastery, which is where they're going to really exit being an ELL. Now, those are 6 different areas of language learning, and we can experience all 6 of these abilities and proficiencies in a single classroom. So this creates a lot of challenge for us as educators in trying to figure out, how do I make sure that those students who are just entering into my class and just beginning to learn English are well supported, but also for those students who might be on the other side who are developing or expanding or are really starting to get into that bridging space, how do I make sure those students are appropriately challenged so they can keep making progress? And so this is where that zone of proximal development can be very useful for us as language educators. So I'm going to ask Amandine if you can click just one time, and this will help us visualize this together on the screen. So what you can see here is, when I'm thinking about the zone of proximal development, what I really need to know is, where are the majority of my students now? And this kind of gives me the center or the zone of my classroom. And then what I'm looking to do is to understand, what is it that my students need help with? Where can I support my students or scaffold my learning? And for those students who are above the zone, what can I offer to them that will allow them to bridge or to stretch their language ability so that they can go even further? So our goal here is to create dynamic programs that allow us to scaffold and stretch for our students so that everyone leaves the classroom with a good learning experience and making progress in English. And by having these granular learning objectives, it's really easy to understand, if this is where my student is now, here is how I can support my students at these different levels of language ability. So if that's something that you're familiar with, that's fantastic. But hopefully you'll find the GSE extremely useful for planning inside of that zone of proximal development. Let's go on to the next slide. There are a lot of fun resources that come with the global scale of English, but the research on this is phenomenal. And this new addition with the WIDA standards is very valuable to educators who are working especially with WIDA in the classrooms. To create the WIDA alignment, what the Global Scale of English team did was to take all of those WIDA can do statements that are aligned to those different proficiency levels. Then they looked at the GSE objectives and began to map those in or align them to the WIDA can do statements. And what this does is it gives us more accurate range of specifically what language proficiency abilities our students will have at each area. So this is something that we really wanted to get into, and this is really where we get some research support to understand how all of this works. So let's go on to the next slide, and I want to show you a little bit of what that looks like. So by doing this mapping and by bringing this in, what that does is it gives us very specific global scale of English ranges that we can look at for these different grades. So take a look here. You're going to see kindergarten. Kindergarten aligns to a 14 to 39 on the GSE. That's going to give us a lot of learning objectives to work with. And the learning objectives cover specific skills. So we'll be able to look at listening, reading, speaking, and writing skills between that 14 to 39 range for those very young learners. And then you can see, as it grows up, you can see how these different skill sets expand. So this really helps us create very dynamic activities for our classroom to support our students as they're growing through these different ranges. And if you're interested in downloading this information, if you'd like to have a copy of this, you'll note there's a QR code on the screen there. If you scan this, this will take you to the website where you'll be able to have access to the WIDA and the Global Scale of English alignment so that you can actually take a look at these learning objectives and how they can work for you inside of your classroom. So I want to give you a bit more of an example of how this works. So we're going to go on to the next slide. And I think, where are we at? Next slide. There we go. So as you can see, when you head over to the website, you'll be able to access these different PDFs. So you can download these and use these on your computer to begin to create interesting and dynamic lessons. And when you take these global scale of English learning objectives with your ELD standards, this really gives you a lot of information so you can begin planning with your students. If you're familiar with the ELD standards, you know that when you pull up those standards, they cover a multiple ranges. So you might have grade 2, 3, or grade 4 or 5. The thing that we get with ELD standards is the language functions and some sample language features. Those language functions and those sample language features can be very informative about the types of language that we might be able to bring into different content areas. But what that doesn't tell us is what level of ability does this sit at, and how challenging could this be for the students that I'm working with? And this is where having the global scale of English is a significant value add, and it really helps us to plan and target the skills that will be most effective for the students in our classroom. And we can do this by using what we call the Global Scale of English Teacher Toolkit. This is a phenomenal tool to support multilingual learners. And what it allows you to do is to search in and really dig into the learning objectives so you can create some fun lessons. So I think this is on the next slide. Let's take a look. All right, it is on the next slide. So, Dean, I'm going to ask if you don't mind stop sharing your screen, because I do like a good dynamic interaction. So let's take a look here at the Global Scale of English Teacher Toolkit. If you want to get access to this teacher toolkit, we're going to drop some links into the chat, so you'll be able to head over here later and get access to this yourself. But really quickly, I'm going to take you on a quick tour of how the toolkit works. So first, and very quickly, just to make sure this is all clear, I have a little present here for us. This is the WIDA, just so everyone can see it here. This is the WIDA alignment for grades 2 and 3. So I'm talking about how this alignment allows us to expand into those WIDA objectives. And what I'm going to scroll down here and look at, and I'm going to show you one that we'll actually use in a case study. In just a second, let's go down to speaking. This is a good one. But you can really get a sense of this. Like, take a look at this. Here, I'm working with my WIDA objectives. My area or my range is speaking. And look at right here where I have the proficiency indicator for developing. And with developing, my WIDA objective stating information from personal or school-related experience. That's a very great objective. It's a good can-do statement. It gives me a lot of information, but when I'm actually planning for that in my classroom, what does that mean? So here you can see here on the right side, these are the global scale of English objectives that are aligned to those WIDA can-do statements. And as you can see, just for this one area, one can-do statement, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 granular objectives that give us a little bit more information about what types of language skills are being described by this can-do statement. And then we also have here the GSE ranges that show us that emerging difficulty and that progression. So that's what you're going to get when you have those mapping booklets. And then when you get into the Global Scale of English Teacher Toolkit, we can go even further. For example, we can choose our different types of learners. Remember, we talked about those pre-primary learners, our kindergarten learners who range from a 14 to a 39 on the GSE. I can actually pin that right here by answering, who am I teaching? And then I can use the ruler to slide from 14 to, I believe it was 39. So we can actually start pinning that in. And now I can really get a sense of how those skills work. And let's say I want to understand what type of reading skills might my students need at this level. So I can even pin the skill. And once you've completed that, you hit this button here that says show results. And there you go. I have 10 results. These are all aligned to reading. These are provided at the level of difficulty. These give me that GSE objective. And this gives me a lot of information that I can use to begin to develop those lessons. So you have the access to all of the learning objectives in the teacher toolkit. You also have the ability to search grammar, so you can dig in and search grammar at a level, and a comprehensive set of vocabulary, including one of my favorite things, which is the Global Scale of English Vocabulary for Young Learners. So again, if I'm working with those learners who might be in that 10 to 39 range, I can pin that information. I could even choose some topics, like maybe I'm talking about animals with my students. I could go even further and at more levels of depth there into what that means. I'm going to show results. And there you see, I have 96 different vocabulary items. And what I love about the GSE Teacher Toolkit is not only do I get the word, the topic, the grammatical category, but underneath of this drop-down menu, you'll also get a definition and an example. And if you're using the Global Scale of English for educational purposes, this is all designed for teachers and to be used inside of your classes. So you can head over to the website at any time, open up this toolkit, and use this along with those different WIDA sets to create lessons for your classroom. All right, I'm going to stop there and hand it back over to Amandine. And if you want to head back to our slide deck, I will talk about one last thing. So I said I had a little case study for you. So let's take a look at that and understand if I'm actually planning a lesson inside of my classroom, what this might look like by bringing in the global scale of English and those learning objectives along with the can-do statements. So here, this is a quick case study that I put together. This is aligned to the ELD standard 4 for grades 2 through 3, and specifically focusing on explaining. And since it's springtime, I thought, this is a great time to do a nice real-world action-focused content piece by having my students think about plant growth cycles. What's great about this is I can actually track this for my classroom. I can have my students go to the window, identify a plant that they want to watch, and document the growth. There are lots of different ways we can do this. I might also bring seeds into my classroom and have my students grow seeds, and maybe we keep some journals, we do some collaborative activities. There are lots of ways to bring this to life. And what I wanted to think about was, if I have these students, again, I know all of my students are multilingual and at slightly different levels of ability, then how do I make sure there's something that everyone walks away from? And this is where the GSE is helpful. So you can see here on the very far side, I have the different WIDA levels from entering to bridging and reaching. Then I took the specific WIDA objectives, those can-do statements. So for example, for entering, one of those can-do statements that the students will be able to answer WH questions. Then I had to think about, okay, but for those entering students, what does that really mean? And here you can see I have my GSE learning objective, which gives me really specific and very detailed information. My students can ask about the identity of an object using a basic phrase. So that's my very lowest level. That's where we're entering in. And so with that information, I create a task. This is the lowest level of ability, and this will really scaffold this activity for those students who are just beginning their English language learning journey. And what I'll have my students do is match pictures of plants to label the different parts of that plant. So they might match the word seed to the picture of the seed in an image that I'm going to give my students. Now, what's great about this, if you think about and you take a look at that right column, this actually indicates all of the scaffolding. So I could have my entering students start here and then encourage them to work up through the different levels of difficulty of this lesson. Once they've matched the pictures, then can they write a simple, complete sentence by filling in a blank? If they can write that sentence by filling in a blank, which is at that emerging level of difficulty, then we can get to, can they actually describe the plant growth? Can they give me a little bit of that explanation? Again, we're slowly scaffolding and slowly building up that skill. Finally, I might have my students develop 3 or 4 more sentences or even a short paragraph before finally I might have my students do some comparison work. I can plan this as a task-based activity with students working time all in the same classroom, where I may have one set of students working on a worksheet where they're labeling the different parts of the plants, and I could have another set of students who are at that bridging and reaching space who are starting to do that comparative analysis of plants and explaining that information. So by getting into these more granular objectives, this really helps me to build that out in my classroom and make sure that all of my students can be successful. And that really is the key benefit of the global scale of English and this research alignment, is being able to tailor the lessons that we're creating based on those ELD standards to really hit into the language learning needs of my students as they're developing them inside of my class. And so I think that's a really nice piece about the global scale of English. And I can't wait to tell you more about that. But at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Amandine and Chris to give you a little bit more about the tools that we have available to help you support your students with WIDA and with Pearson. Amandine.
Thank you so much, Sarah. That's so good to kind of see a case study in practice of just how the GSE can kind of bring a lesson to life, and now we've aligned it to WIDA. You know how that can really, yeah, support some of the needs that we have in our multilingual classrooms. My name is Chris. As Amanda mentioned, I work in the English language learning global product team at Pearson. And what I'd like to use this section for is to kind of move on from the global scale of English and look at how it can practically address some of the challenges that we've heard, and we know that teachers might be facing in a multilingual classroom. And what I'd like to do is to kind of frame it as part of a journey, right? So from placement to learning to progress monitoring to remediation, how does the GSE and how can it really respond to some of these challenges? So we're going to look at an example of that in the second section. But before we do that, I think it's useful to frame some of the challenges. My role within the product team is essentially getting really close to our educators, our customers, and understanding the challenges they're facing, understanding some of the insights that we can then bring into the work we do in developing new courses, assessments, and then the GSE underpinning all of that essentially. So to do that, I've just outlined a starting point on the next slide. I don't think this is an exhaustive list, and it would be great if there's any comments in the chat around other particular challenges and maybe pain points that should be called out here. But some things that we've heard, particularly in the US context, is around often the need to supplement the course that's being used with other sources, other materials, to really kind of respond to learner needs. We've heard that the topic of kind of diagnosing, placing, monitoring progress, that formative assessment side of things can be a challenge, particularly in the context of maybe mixed ability classes, different backgrounds, different contexts, and trying to bring that all together into one journey. And as Sarah mentioned, the zone of proximal development can be bigger, it can be smaller, right? And often it can vary quite a lot. And then one of the other things I think we've heard is around the need to develop, the kind of onus to develop other skills alongside English proficiency. We know that in the WIDA ELD standards, right, that's a really kind of key theme around, yes, obviously many of the learning objectives are around English proficiency, but there's also other skills and competencies that are brought into that. So how can we kind of address that, and how can we bring that into our classroom in a way which is really effective and really compelling? I'm just looking at the chat because I can see there's a few other comments here, which is great to see. So Priscilla's mentioned motivation when it comes to reading and writing in particular. Yeah, it's such a good point there. And Denise mentions one common challenge that I have is time. I only see my students for 30 minutes. And yeah, like couldn't agree more. Often we're the time we have to plan, the time we have with our students in the first place is so limited. So being able to kind of make the most of that is a massive challenge. Abigail mentions the reluctancy of the students to speak English. So yeah, so beyond reading and writing, we know that speaking, not only developing proficiency but developing confidence to feel like students can speak securely in the classroom, I think is again a challenge that we see quite a lot. So thank you so much for adding these. Please keep doing it, and yeah, we'll keep monitoring the chat because these are all really useful insights. So I think oh sorry, Mohammed's also put something else in there. Problems are different in different cultures. They depend on teachers and students, learning environment. They depend on the context as well. Yeah, couldn't agree more. Very much dependent on the context. So I'll keep monitoring this, but what I'd like to do is to try and look at, how the GSE, how the global scale of English, and now the alignment that it has to the WIDA standard can really help address and look at kind of solving and also supporting educators and learners in their classroom context. So if you move on to the next slide, when it comes to the way that we develop our English language learning solutions in Pearson, we look at it from the perspective of courses, assessment, and certification. Those are the three main pillars of the products and the materials that we create. And as you can see here, all of these are underpinned by the global scale of English. So whether we're looking at developing a new course, whether we're developing a new formative assessment, whether it's a teacher training resource, the global scale of English is essentially the glue and the underpinning that holds all of this together. And on this slide here, you can see a couple of examples of the global scale of English in action. So when it comes to the courses that we have, two examples I've cited here are My Disney Stars and Heroes, the World American edition for elementary, middle school ages, both built off the GSE. So the learning objectives are brought into the lessons, they're brought into the teacher's book, and underpin everything that we do around the scope and sequence. The GSE underpins assessments, so placement tests called level, progress testing called benchmark, our young learners progress testing as well. These are all reported on the GSE, and this is something that I'll show a little bit later. And it also comes into our partnerships as well. At Pearson, we are delighted to work with the likes of Disney, the BBC, with the content that we put into our courses. So that's something that hopefully will kind of respond to some of the challenges around motivation and engagement in the classroom. So on the next slide, we wanted to give a bit of an example of what the global scale of English GSE could look like in action. And to start with, we wanted to give an example of the My Disney Stars and Heroes course. This is a 6-level course along with a starter level. And I'm going to show a video, in fact, of the first level, which are covering the global scale of English range of 14 to 24. And essentially, this is built on the GSE learning objectives. For each lesson, if we start the video, we'll just show an example of what that experience could look like. For each lesson, you will find essentially learning objectives for the skill that that lesson is developing. So whether it's reading, listening, speaking, or writing, there would be learning objectives, and the content would be essentially built along that. Here you can see an example of some of the Disney content that we have in the course. So we kind of build our partnerships on top of the global scale of English. And here you can see an example of one of the videos. And this will essentially give our learners the opportunity to understand and be presented with the key vocabulary through a really engaging and compelling video with hopefully, film that they really like. Here we can also see the fact that the My Disney Stars and Heroes course brings in some of those other competencies alongside English proficiency development. So, for example, for the WIDA levels 2 and 3, one of the key areas is around, interpreting narrations, being able to glean details to understand a central message. So all of these competencies alongside English proficiency are also being brought into the picture through the way that we're kind of putting the lessons together here. And also My Disney Stars and Heroes has a really key focus on future skills. These are skills such as social awareness, self-management, creativity, higher order thinking skills, responsible decision making. These are all kind of embedded into the curriculum, into the lessons of each level here. And here you can see even the platform has a few nice interactive features that can kind of bring out some of the motivating elements. So because of the global scale of English, we're able to kind of bring all of these things together and ultimately, hopefully, provide an experience for multilingual learners, which kind of, yes, it has the learning objectives at its core, but it also brings in other things like partnerships. It brings in higher order thinking skills, future skills, engaging digital content, and really kind of allows us to make the most of a limited time that we have with our multilingual learners. On the next slide, you can see an example of kind of that challenge of supplementing courses, being able to draw different sources from different places. Because of the global scale of English, what we're able to do is to kind of move much beyond just one course book. And here you can see an example of, for the teachers and for the students, they would have a really full and comprehensive and holistic range of resources that could be used both in the classroom and outside the classroom, whether it's print or digital as well. So again, thanks to that kind of underpinning, we can move beyond and bring much more resources and content to our learners and to our educators. So this might be a starting point, maybe in addressing some of these challenges, but I don't think it stops there. One of the other key challenges that we've heard is around that element of diagnosing, monitoring progress, and especially in the context of maybe mixed ability classes, different backgrounds, how can we kind of keep track and then remediate in a way which both can be kind of personalized, but also at a group level understands the main themes and the main areas that need maybe extra practice or maybe needs a bit of improvement. So in the next slide, what I wanted to show was a second video and looking at how the GSE is used in assessment and how it can really accelerate progress in a way which maybe we haven't seen before. So if I start the video here, this is an example of our benchmark test. And when we get to that stage of the year where maybe we need to track progress, this is a 40-minute test that we can give to our learners, and the report that they would get, as you can see here, provide GSE scores for each of the communicative skills, but it also leverages the learning objectives into really clear and concise performance summaries. And from there, I can even choose the course that I'm using. So let's say it's My Disney Stars and Heroes, and it will give me recommended activities from that course to say, okay, this is your score for reading. These are the activities in the course that will help you address some of those areas of improvement or some of those gaps that maybe need to be covered in class. And here I'm just showing the process of assigning those particular activities within our learning platform. And this is only really possible because of the global scale of English. The fact that both of the course and the assessment are both built off the global scale of English means that we can kind of cross-reference the learning objectives and then use the activities that are based on the same learning objectives as you're seeing in the report to address some of those gaps. And this is something that we do for pretty much all the courses that we create now. And there's always that link between both the course itself and the ability to assess it and map it and link it to the progress monitoring and placement tools that we have at our disposition. One other thing just to mention here is also that there is a young learners version of our benchmark test as well. So whether it's teenagers looking at that kind of middle school, upper secondary, but also elementary, we have the tools in place there to monitor progress, whatever the age or whatever the level of the student. So I think this just gives a couple of examples of how the global scale of English is really at the core of everything we're doing within Pearson English language learning. It's the kind of glue that holds everything together. And now that we've been able to align it and map it to the WIDA learning objectives and the WIDA standards, we're really excited to kind of start working with educators in the K-12 space to really look at how we can kind of bring this into the classroom, help address some of those challenges, and yeah, bring the global scale of English into the classroom in a new and compelling way. And the last slide that I've put here is just to kind of go back a little bit and show the journey and just how the global scale of English can be used at each stage, whether it's at planning, teaching, checking, remediating, and assessing. What we can see for planning are some of the tools that Sarah presented. So, for example, the Teacher Toolkit, fantastic planning resource, freely available, doesn't even need a login to access some of those, kind of learning objectives and get you on the right footing to start preparing a course or a curriculum. But even if you're using a specific course, we have a mapping booklet in the teacher's resources anyway. So that's something that will be ready-made and there beyond the teacher toolkit for any user of, let's say, My Disney Stars and Heroes or Wider World. And then for teaching and learning, the GSE underpins all the content in our students' book, our workbook, and any supplementary resources that might be used, such as readers, for example. One of the challenges raised in the chat was around that kind of reading and writing challenge around getting students motivated in those skills. So, the GSE can support some of the ways in which we can address those gaps as well. And when it comes to checking, repairing, again, we have extra resources here and the assessments such as Benchmark that are, again, based on the global scale of English, report on the global scale of English, and really provide detailed insights and reports, both to students, to parents. These reports can be translated as well. So especially in the context of multilingual learners, the ability to, provide maybe a report in Spanish or another language is something that we feel will really add value to both learners themselves and also parents. And then finally, at assessment, the global scale of English will always be there as our tool, whether it's progress assessment, summative assessment, to see, to be able to verify and certify the level that's being reached at the end of the program. So hopefully this just gives a snapshot. I think it's a starting point. There's a lot more to unpack, but just an idea of how the global scale of English is being embedded in our English language learning solutions, and how we think it can really help address some of those challenges that we've been hearing and looking to identify in the US K-12 space. So I will, I think, hand back to Amandine, where we will look at addressing any questions that have come up and any further information.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you, Sarah. Yeah, so after this great webinar, we are opening it up for questions. So feel free to drop your questions in the question and answers or the chat. We will be monitoring it as well, and then we will be answering as all the questions that we can. So Chris and Sarah, there are some questions for you, and then maybe you can take turns on answering. So another question is, how has Pearson's products, how has EI instruction evolved in the past 2 years, and Pearson's adapting those products for the instruction and the evolvement that there is?
Could you just repeat the question, Randy? Sorry, I didn't quite hear that.
Sorry, let me get that again. So how has the EL instruction evolved the past 2 years, and how are you adapting to it within our curriculum and the products that we create?
So how has ELL, like English language learning instruction, evolved, and then how is Pearson addressing other products? Chris, I don't know if you want to kick off there. I can speak a little bit to how we've seen changes inside of English language instruction over the last couple of years. I think all of us have been doing this for a while. Many of you have probably been teaching for the last 2 to 3 years. Some of you may have started in the profession post-pandemic. Some of you may have been here when we went through the pandemic. And I think that one thing that we're all very aware of is times have absolutely changed when it comes to working with our language learners. Our expectations are very different of what our students need to be able to do. Not only are we looking for our students to be able to communicate and to build those communicative proficiencies inside of the classroom, we're also expecting our students to have competencies in a variety of digital communication as well. So being able to type, being able to use chats and communicate through messengers. And as educators, we're taking all of that into consideration in the classroom. I think the other key and really significant thing that we're seeing that's changing in ELL education is making sure that our students are not just building what we would consider basic English abilities, where they might be able to ask and answer questions and really a lot of transactional English, just talking about their lives, but we're also thinking about academic English, language that we need to be able to communicate the content we're learning in different subject areas so that our students can be successful, not just in the English classroom, but broadly inside of our education community. So I think those are a couple of the key changes that we've seen. Pedagogically, I don't think that the practice has changed. We've become much more student-centered and just really focused on making sure our students can use language. Although I do note one of the comments from the chat here was, getting students past that silent processing phase is a challenge. And I think that's where, especially with WIDA, you have a significant benefit because we're not just looking at language standards, but we're looking at those standards inside of specific content areas that allow us to develop those skills. So I think that's kind of a little bit about how it's changed. But Chris, how is Pearson addressing that inside of the product?
Yeah, I think this is a really, really interesting question. And yeah, to kind of piggyback on the first point you made, Sarah, around the kind of format and the way that like materials are being digested, I think that has a massive implication on how we develop new courses, new materials, because the age of the traditional course book printed, has probably passed. We need to do much more than that now, and it's a really exciting challenge of looking at, okay, learners, especially during the pandemic, there was a lot of virtual learning. There's a lot of digital platforms inside the classroom, outside the classroom. We have certain elements of customer base that we serve to, which are looking for mobile solutions that might not necessarily be across the board, but there's a lot of different formats, and for us, it's not enough just to take a print book and then put it onto a screen. Like, it's got to be the learning design and the pedagogy and the experience has to really be kind of native and suited to the format that it's in. So for us, I think that's a challenge, but it's a really exciting one and something that I think we're making kind of good progress to addressing. I think the other one, it is, I mean, AI tools are definitely, they are something that we know are kind of a bit of an elephant in the room, both for learners, educators, and education providers such as ourselves. And it is, definitely something that in the context of students maybe be able to kind of, generate things using AI tools. We need to think about the way we assess that. We kind of build in relevant checks, integrity, and also being able to maximize the potential of these tools as well and these capabilities. So watch this space for some really exciting developments there, because there are some really exciting kind of projects and tools that we're developing to support teachers primarily in lesson planning, in developing speaking practice, using some of those kind of AI capabilities. So that's a bit of a teaser, and something that we'll be hearing much more about in the near future.
Thank you, Chris. Could you talk a little bit about how Pearson solutions can be used in small? So, for example, we have someone saying they only have 30 minutes. Could you go over that and kind of like explain how it can be added and taken out and adapted to the needs of the classroom?
Absolutely, and I think Sarah, you might want to add to this, because I think that the global scale of English for GCSE is the place to start, really. It's something that really does help kind of break down what might seem like intimidating scope and sequences or curriculum into kind of digestible bite-sized chunks. And that's, I think, one of the key aims that we have, right, in developing things such as the teacher toolkit, such as the mapping booklets that we have with our courses, is to enable an educator, if they know that, okay, this week they've only got 30 minutes or a couple of lessons or whatever time I have with our students, I'm not kind of bound to going through the course in a linear fashion. I can use toolkit or the mapping booklet to pick out what are the objectives that I need to address. What are the, or let's start with WIDA, let's say, what are the WIDA objectives that are key for me to address here? What does that mean in terms of the global scale of English? So using that case study that Sarah prepared, for example, and then through the mapping that we have, being able to identify lessons, activities that respond to that. And there's a really intuitive that is, it doesn't mean kind of spending ages flicking through pages. It's very kind of clearly structured and laid out. So I think that would be my kind of initial thinking there. I don't know, Sarah, if you want to add anything to that from your GSE
No.
hats on.
Absolutely. I think there, as an educator, and I've worked with a lot of teachers, and we all have different types of learning experiences where, depending on your schedule, you may only see your students, I think it was 30 minutes a day. I was in a situation where I only saw my students 45 minutes a week, and I only saw them once a week. So altogether, at the end of the month, I barely had 4 hours with my students. So trying to think about what can I accomplish in that amount of time is really challenging. And when you think, Amandine, do you mind if I steal the presentation from you a second? I'm going to ask you to stop sharing your screen. I'm a show and tell teacher, and if you have more questions about this, the chat is working now. I noted it was not working when I started, so if you had a question that you wanted to ask, now is a really great time to ask this. And I'm going to head back into this the GSE booklet here. So again, this is the mapping booklet for the WIDA and the GSE alignment. And what I want to draw your attention to, again, that developing can-do statement that we have. Stating information from personal or school-related experiences. I know from professional experience that this objective cannot be accomplished in a 30-minute class. It cannot be accomplished in 5 30-minute classes. This is the type of can-do statement that's going to take multiple different experiences with my students. They're going to need to see this in a variety of different contexts, so that they might be talking about personal information on the first day of school. Where do you live? What's your address? They might talk about personal information in my class where I ask them to describe their home. What color is their room? What types of things do they have inside of their house? They might describe personal information in another class where we talk about our family, where our families come from, the cultures and traditions that you have inside of your family. We might talk about personal information in another class where we get into hobbies or maybe interests, like what type of entertainment do you like? What type of movies? What books do you like to read? So when I think about something like this, when I look at this type of can-do statement, I can already see this is a huge amount of learning. This is a lot to take care of. And so just breaking that down is a massive benefit here at the GSE, because I kind of did that out loud, but you can see here, the global scale of English provides that same level of granularity in the context, so I can really break this down. And with these granular objectives, talking about things they can or can't do with a simple fixed expression, that's much more achievable in 1 or 2 30-minute classes versus this much larger can-do statement, which is going to be something I develop over time. So that's the first way that I would really use the GSE to dig into that. The other way that I would use the GSE here is to really stack up my content, so that I might start here at a GSE 28 and then plan for my next 30-minute class to maybe get into something that's at that GSE 31 and then build it forward from there. Depending on the curriculum framework that you're using, so pedagogically, if you're using something like the present, practice, produce, or maybe you're using the 5 E's, the other way that I might think about this is if I have this global scale of English objective and I'm working through a 5E format, I might break down my class so that each of those 30-minute segments covers a different stage of the E. This is something that I do recommend to teachers if you're working with a fixed lesson plan format, is rather than trying to cram all of the pedagogical steps into one 30-minute lesson, think about, if I have 30 minutes just to explain, if I have 30 minutes just to engage, how can I use that 30 minutes effectively, and then build on that in each of those different classes. Using these granular objectives can really help with that. And then using that plus Pearson content. And as Chris mentioned, all of the Pearson products come with these global scale of English mapping booklets that allow you to see where these objectives are specifically covered inside of the content. That can also allow you to plan some really engaging learning experiences that will take advantage of the time. So that's a little bit of the advice that I would get there on how we could use the GSE to address some of those challenges.
Okay. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Chris. Okay, so we are at the end of our webinar. So thank you everyone for participating. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to our panelists today or myself. We will be sending out an email after with the webinar recording, a link to the GSL toolkit, as well as our catalog and a link to our website for any information that you may want. And then, yes, let me share my screen again. And then I will also be dropping a link with a quick survey where you will be able to let us know how that webinar went. And you should be able to see my screen now, and I will be dropping that link in the chat. Thank you everyone for participating today, and then we will talk to you at the next time. Thank you.